Alright, welcome back to the Security Plus prep course. We are now on section 18. We're going to be talking about vulnerabilities and attacks. So the agenda today, we're going to talk about hardware, Bluetooth, mobile. All of these are vulnerabilities and different attacks that are associated with them. We'll talk a little bit about zero-day vulnerabilities, our operating system vulnerabilities. Then we'll start talking about software vulnerabilities to include SQL, XML, cross-scripting, and cross-site request forgeries. We'll talk a little bit about what a buffer overflow is and why they're so important in cybersecurity. And then we'll finish on our finale of race conditions. So the first place we're going to start is going to be hardware vulnerabilities. Hardware vulnerabilities refer to the weaknesses or flaws in physical devices and their components. These can be exploited by attackers to gain, unauthorized access, manipulate systems, or even just integrity to our data. Now, we don't want any compromisation to our CII triad, so integrity of data is definitely a big deal. These vulnerabilities can exist in the device or processes, in anything that can store or transmit data, so things like CPUs or memory chips, and even in our network devices, such as network interfaces and peripheral devices. So, unlike software vulnerabilities, hardware vulnerabilities often require physical access to devices, but certain times they can be exploited remotely through specific attacks. So, there's a few different attacks that we need to think about when we're dealing about hardware vulnerabilities. The first one's going to be CPU vulnerabilities. Well, we all know that the CPU, the central processing unit of our system, is definitely a key component of any computing device. Without it, we wouldn't have a computing device. And so these vulnerabilities in the CPUs can allow attackers to exploit it anywhere where we're processing data. For example, we can look at execution vulnerabilities like Spectre or Meltdown, because these two revealed data to the attackers that there was a CPU level flaw that let them access sensitive data such as passwords, encryption keys, or anything really in plain text, to the fact we're all the way down to the machine level zeros and ones. Then we moved on to our firmware vulnerabilities. Firmware is definitely what's embedded in all of our hardware devices, which allow them to operate. Firmware vulnerabilities can be exploited by installing small but yet malicious code that will persist even through system reboots. Since firmware vulnerabilities are such at a low level, any attacker who compromises it gets a deep control over the device. Think about rootkits in this nation. All right, we talk about peripheral device vulnerabilities such as our USB drives, our printers, maybe in our external hard drives. Anything that we plug into the system or add to the system can add additional vulnerabilities into our systems. For example, if we can use an infected USB drive to deliver malware directly to the target machine. This is why things like throwing jump drives out into a parking lot is very easily an easy way for an attacker to get within the system, because someone will pick one up in the parking lot and plug one into their system. We can talk about supply chain vulnerabilities. We've got to all get our hardware from somewhere, so sometimes the attacker will go straight to the global supply chain where our devices are being created, and hopefully they can get in there. During the manufacturing process, they can compromise devices before they even reach us. This can lead to hardware that is already backdoored or modified, which makes it very hard for us to detect. Then we can get into physical tampering. Some hardware vulnerabilities may require physical access to the device. Well, attackers can tamper with the hardware components, such as inserting malicious chips or physically modifying circuit boards to introduce backdoors, or as easy as plugging in a drive-by device like a USB jump drive. Finally, we have some of our hardest attacks, which are going to be side channel attacks. And side channel attacks exploit indirect information like power consumption, electromagnetic emissions, or timing patterns due to sensitive information. So these attacks are very difficult to detect because they don't rely on direct access to the system, but instead monitoring of the physical characteristics. Well, how do we mitigate some of this stuff? Well, mitigating hardware vulnerabilities most of the time is going to come back to, let's keep our firmware and microcode all up to date. Manufacturers will release firmware and microcode when they detect hardware flaws, and regularly we want to apply these in regular intervals to help us protect against known weaknesses. We want to make sure that our physical security is protected. We want to make sure that we're mitigating these vulnerabilities and requiring tamper or direct access or preventing direct access to the device. We should definitely implement strong physical security controls, such as surveillance and access restrictions, and making sure that we have things like tamper evident seals to prevent attackers or unauthorized users from accessing our physical gear. Hardware security modules, otherwise known as HSMs, are any specialized device to protect sensitive data, and this is going to be in the cryptographic world. This is all talking about key generation for encryption and for decryption. So as we isolate these different pieces of hardware through HSMs, they can help us reduce hardware vulnerabilities from being exploited. We should monitor our hardware, especially for unusual behavior, such as unexpected power consumption, performance degradation, or even unauthorized modifications. Side channel attacks, for example, may exhibit detectable patterns which would be then flagged by a monitoring service. And then lastly, we probably should double check our supply chain security. Remember the section where we talked about vendor management. Vendor management is very important in cybersecurity, and we want to make sure that these vulnerabilities are not being introduced into the hardware, whether or not it's in manufacturing or even distribution of the hardware that we're getting every day. Let's talk about Bluetooth vulnerabilities. We all rely on Bluetooth heavily. As we all know, it is a wireless protocol that enables us to communicate over short distances. We're talking about 33 feet, 10 meters in most cases, right? And it powers everything from smartphones to headphones to medical equipment to even automotive systems. Most TPS sensors are now not even running on radio frequencies, they're running on Bluetooth. Despite that being convenient, and there's so many people using it, there are a ton of weaknesses as we move through here. So what are some of those common vulnerabilities? Well, Bluetooth has what we call BLE, Bluetooth Low Energy weakness, which allows Bluetooth designed for devices to operate with minimum power consumption. While BLE is highly efficient because it doesn't use very much power, we normally use it for IoT devices. It has been found to have several vulnerabilities because it lacks authentication and encryption mechanisms due to the fact that it's so low power consumption. Which brings us to lack of encryption. A lot of Bluetooth communication can't be established without proper communication, or can be, and so attackers will then intercept and read the data being transmitted. This is normally man-in-the-middle or on-path attacks, and these allow attackers to eavesdrop or even manipulate communication between these two devices. Now, Bluetooth has been around for a while, especially Bluetooth Classic, and so we've got to be careful because outdated versions of Bluetooth won't have the same encryption standards as our current version of Bluetooth. So a lot of these older devices are more susceptible to attacks because of the weak security measures. A lot of our Bluetooth devices also use weak or no authentication when pairing, which makes it a lot easier for an attacker to impersonate us and allow to connect to our devices without our access. And then lastly, we've got discoverable mode by default, which means all of our devices are broadcasting themselves so we can help detect other devices within range. Attackers will take this to advantage, discover the devices, and initiate unsolicited connections or exploiting the device vulnerabilities to gain access to our devices. Now, there's a few different common attacks when it comes to Bluetooth, and I want to make sure that we understand each one. All right, the first one's going to be bluejacking. Bluejacking is harmless, but quite annoying because this is a Bluetooth attack where attackers can send unsolicited messages or files to any of the Bluetooth-enabled devices. While bluejacking does not compromise the security of the device, it can be used to distract users or deliver unwanted content such as messages or ads. Bluejacking. Blue snarfing, on the other hand, is a little more serious of a Bluetooth attack. This is when an attacker gains unauthorized access to the device without the user's knowledge. By exploiting vulnerabilities in Bluetooth protocols like low encryption or no encryption algorithms, an attacker can steal sensitive information such as contact lists, messages, or any file located on the device. Another term that you should know for the SecurityPlus is going to be blue bugging. Blue bugging is an attack that allows attackers to gain control over the victim's Bluetooth enabled device. And once the device is compromised, the attacker can execute commands on the device. They can make phone calls, send messages, listen on conversations such as eavesdropping, pretty much having root access to the device all they want. So it has been deemed as blue bug because of an eavesdropping device. We've got things called Bluetooth impersonation, or BTI. Bluetooth impersonation is an attacker masquerades as a trusted device or mimics another Bluetooth device, so that way your phone will automatically start communicating with it. The attacker can connect to the victim's device without raising suspicion and steal data or take control of the device. And they can actually take control either way. Well, how do we mitigate this? Well, just like always, we should use strong authentication and encryption. Ensure that all of our Bluetooth devices are using the latest Bluetooth security protocols like Secure Simple Pairing, SSP. This will help us prevent unauthorized access. We should turn off discoverability on our Bluetooth, especially when we're not using it, because we don't want to broadcast to nearby devices unless we need it to. We should definitely update our manufacturing firmware to the latest and greatest to make sure that Bluetooth enabled devices are protected against known security flaws. We should probably disable Bluetooth all in all when not in use. This will help prevent the attacker from using it at all. We should use some of the Bluetooth security features. Many Bluetooth devices offer built-in security features, such as the ability to reject unknown and unauthorized pairing requests, so we should probably turn these on by default. And then lastly, we should monitor the device behavior. Anything unusual, especially on a Bluetooth device, like connection prompts, could show an indicator of compromise. That takes us into mobile vulnerabilities. Mobile vulnerabilities like smartphones and tablets are definitely essential for everyday use now. And we should know about certain vulnerabilities that comes with these devices. First one we want to talk about would be insecure applications. If we allow every user to install whatever application they want, especially on a company-owned device, then they can install a piece of software that may have malware, lack of encryption, insufficient authentication mechanisms, or just be open for exploitation. We don't want to use devices that are too old, such as iOS or Android, because their devices will be known for security flaws. You need, just like an operating system, you still wouldn't want to run Windows XP today because it has known security flaws. So why are you still running an older version of Android or iOS? It's time to update those. This brings me to weak encryption. A lot of data stored on the phones are normally inadequately encrypted, so as soon as an attacker can intercept it, they can normally read it or break into it very easily. A lot of us will connect to any Wi-Fi or network connection, which allows us to collect like public Wi-Fi, and it makes it easier for the attackers to intercept our data. We've already talked about Bluetooth vulnerabilities, but they're all still here, such as blue snarfing and blue jacking. We also have weak authentication mechanisms. Most mobile devices are easily guessable authentication methods such as PIN codes or patterns or even biometric authentication because it makes it easier for us to use, which also makes it easier for the attackers to gain in. Some people like to root their phone, which means they're going to bypass security restrictions. So anything that we tried to do to protect the device is now undone. And then lastly, because of everything above, we may have malware and ransomware. Mobile devices are now being targeted with ransomware, and they can definitely be delivered through apps, phishing attacks, compromised websites, a whole bunch of different things. And these are here to steal data because most of the time we have our work files also on our phones. So the different type of attacks that we see most often happen to a mobile device, one would be the phishing attack. Phishing attack is going to be mostly through SMS or email or even some of our messaging apps so that we try to pose as legitimate organizations. We've got on-path, or otherwise known as man-in-the-middle attacks, and these type of attacks are just anything to help intercept, and most of the time when you're going to see these are going to be on public Wi-Fi networks, where attackers can eavesdrop on unsecured network connections and easily retransmit, replay, or whatever they need to do. We've got malicious applications, where they may try to get a malicious app onto your phone. These will also may even be in the official app stores, and so we may have to be careful that we don't install a rat on our own phone, because they're definitely going to be an eavesdropping device at that point. You can do SIM swapping, where the attacker will go to the mobile carrier to trick them into transferring the victim's phone number to another SIM card, taking over your phone, which most of us use for 2FA or multi-factor authentication. We have a lot of spyware and surveillance that can be installed, again, through random apps or phishing campaigns. Going to be a malware piece here. And then lately, we're now starting to see more ransomware that will encrypt the data on the phone and demanding ransom for restored access. So how do we mitigate it? Well, just like always, let's keep our software updated. Let's make sure that we're using only trusted apps. Let's enable device encryption, which most of us don't even have on. How about we use authentication and use better multi-factor authentication, maybe pen and fingerprint to log into our phones. Let's try not to use public Wi-Fi for sensitive information. Let's disable our Bluetooth and Wi-Fi when not in use. And lastly, we can install security software to make sure all of the above happens seamlessly. So let's talk about zero-day attacks. A zero-day vulnerability refers to a previously unknown flaw or weakness in software, hardware, or firmware that is discovered by attackers before the vendor or developers are aware of it. I would even go as far as users here as well. These are flaws that aren't patched or don't have patches because we didn't even know they existed. So zero-day exploits are normally very, very bad because they can launch the attack before it is publicly known or even be able to be patched. We have a few different types of zero-day vulnerabilities. We got some that can do remote code execution, right? We can make sure that attackers are trying to get in remotely by using malicious code. They could try to escalate their privileges, where maybe they can come into the system as a normal user and privilege escalate themselves to an admin user. They can install malware onto our system at zero-day, and because the vulnerability is unknown, traditional antivirus from anti-malware tools won't be able to detect it. They can use it against us by pushing a DDoS or a DDoS attack or a denial of service attack to overwhelm our system and bring it down, or they could just steal the data entirely. Another thing you should know about is operating system vulnerabilities. Now, operating system vulnerabilities are just anything that happens on the operating system. They can be exploited to gain unauthorized access, execute malicious code, disrupt services, or even steal sensitive information. And what do these kind of look like? Well, we can always have privilege escalation, which is just anything trying to get to a higher level. And be aware there are two different terms in privilege escalation. There is vertical escalation and horizontal escalation. Vertical escalation means that they're going from a normal user to maybe an admin account. So they're getting more privileges as they go up. Versus horizontal escalation, maybe it's just hopping from one user to another user of the same level because maybe that user has the permissions they need to access a different file. Unpatched systems are definitely a huge vulnerability. Buffer overflows, which we'll talk more about in a minute, is a huge vulnerability. We have default configurations. Well, we probably should definitely secure down our configurations. Remote code execution, which means attackers are able to execute any type of command on the system without needing physical access. Now, we're trying to block this a little bit more, but again, it depends if your system is up to date. We've got things like race conditions, which we'll talk about more. And then we have weak file permissions, like maybe we just are a little lazy on our file permissions. We allow all users to access certain types of files, maybe even system files. Now, attackers now can exploit this for their own gain. And then lastly, we could have something like insecure authentication mechanisms, like outdated authentication, or not even using MFA, for instance. So that way they can use captured credentials and access the system directly. Well, how do we patch? You can see a theme here, patching and updates. How about we give everybody least privilege, only the permissions they need to complete their job and nothing more. We should audit this and make sure that everything is up to par and configured the way we want it to be to make sure that a security posture is there. And we should make sure our systems are hardened. In other words, only having the things running that are needed for us to continue doing business. If we look at our security tools, are they installed and up to date? This is antivirus, IDS, IPS, whatever it may be, EDR. Are they segmented so that way not every machine can speak to every machine? And then lastly, let's come back to EDR. Let's make sure we have our solutions installed so we can monitor our endpoints for any malicious activity. This could include our antivirus, IDS, and IPS, but normally they go a step further to make sure we gather logs and continue for any indicators of compromise. Let's talk about our SQL and XML injections. So SQL injection and even XML injection are two types of attacks that exploit vulnerabilities in applications to mostly manipulate database queries. Okay, and here's an example. So if I have a username of John and a password of 123, I normally would then put that into a SQL query like select everything from users where John is this and password is this. Well, that's a really bad SQL statement because I could send just a little bit of code in here to say, hey, give me username this, or give me 1 equals 1, which is going to be true, and password equals blank. With this or here, now it's going to just give me back all users no matter what, or it will just authorize me from accessing the system directly. Now XML looks almost the same. Instead of just passing username and password, I can actually add different things in XML, maybe role, for instance. Maybe I'm trying to get an admin role, and then that way I can escalate myself into an admin role without actually having admin credentials. Well, how do we protect against all of this? Well, the first thing is we should be doing input validation. If we expect a phone number, make sure it's a phone number. If it's anything but a phone number, then we need to error it out and send it back to the user saying that it's an invalid input. We could also use prepared statements. This lets us separate the SQL code from user inputs, and so that way we can treat the inputs as data rather than executable code. This prevents attackers from injecting malicious code within our system. We can use things like stored procedures within the database itself to ensure that it's executed by the application, and this way SQL injection cannot be happening because, again, the data is going to be treated as data and not as query logic. We should make sure that XML libraries have proper parsers, just like with SQL. Best way we can ensure that only certain attributes that are called for are being used, so that way other expandability, like other features, cannot be called upon. We should definitely have some additional error handling because we don't want to display detailed error messages, because sometimes those error messages will reveal like database schemas, query structures, or even internal data that can help attackers refine their injections to get better responses. We shouldn't run everything with all privileges, so we need to make sure that certain queries are ran under certain users to ensure that the database cannot spew everything in the database all at once on accident. And then always we need to test our applications to make sure that their security posture is still as strong as it once was. Let's talk a little bit about cross-site scripting and a little bit about cross-site request forgery. Cross-site scripting is a type of attack when an attacker injects malicious web scripts into a web page that can be viewed by other users. And we'll give an example of that. While request forgery is an attack where an attacker tricks the victim into performing unwanted actions where they can be also authenticated. So what is a cross sorry. What is a cross-site scripting example look like? Well, here's an example. Maybe we can inject a script on there that says, hey, there's an attack onto a field on a website. If the website does not sanitize the input, the malicious script is now stored in the database, and everyone who will see it can actually see this. This used to be very popular with social media because anyone who would log into that web page would then run that script on their local PC, but it only got worse because then they would steal things like cookies or other information. There are a few different types of XSS. There's stored, otherwise known as persistent XSS, cross-site server scripting, and this stored is permanently stored on the target server, most of the time in a database or in a file structure. That's why any user that accesses that page will then launch that script and run it by their own browsers. Now there's reflected, where the malicious script is included in the URL of the submission and normally reflected back to the user's web page. So it's not like on the server, but instead the attacker tricks the victim into clicking a link that includes injected script and then executed when the page loads. And then lastly, we have DOM, or DOM, which is all based on client side. So this is a client side JavaScript rather than the server, where the attacker will modify a document object model, a DOM, of the page and have it directly go through malicious server, a JavaScript. So that way the server is not involved in the injection, but the attacker occurs entirely within the browser. It's pretty cool. So what's the impact of cross-site? Well, we can have session hijacking where they steal cookies and let them do impersonate the victim. Credential theft, a lot of times to create fake login forms. Think about SET on this one. We can have website defacement, where the attacker just changes the appearance of the website and putting maybe malicious content out there. Or maybe we even use their server to deliver the malware to other users. How do we mitigate this? Well, we need to make sure we do input validation, just like SQL injection. We need to make sure that we use content security policies to make sure that unauthorized scripts don't just run because they're on our server, because maybe we didn't put them there. We make sure we use HTTP only, otherwise secure known cookies, which cookies are going to be a thing of the past soon, but just know. And then disable inline JavaScript. In other words, we're not going to use JavaScript within the body of our forms, but maybe only in the header of our form. Now, how does cross-site work in difference? Well, cross-site's a little bit different because what we're going to do is we're going to trick an attacker. The attacker is going to trick the victim, to perform unwanted actions on the website where they've already been authenticated. So think of this like man-in-the-middle attacks. For instance, straight from the book, a user logs into a web application such as an online banking site. We now store the session on a session cookie. The attacker tricks the user into visiting the malicious site, which contains hidden forms, so that way we can send requests to the banking site. Because we're already authorized on the banking site, our request will go through, their request will go through our computer, which then will then send the money straight to us. So in the code, maybe we see, hey, here's a form action. It's going to post to an account number and maybe transfer us $1,000. Yay! Well, how do we see this? Well, we can have unauthorized transactions, right? This is data modifications and privilege escalation. Basically, call this like a hijacking of our existing session. We have to have an existing session for this to work. So they're taking one of our previous sessions. Maybe we never clicked log out on a website. That's kind of bad practice, but maybe we did. And if we go to a bad website, they can use cross-site request forgeries to continue with that session through us. There are a few different mitigations for this. Again, better cookies, better refer headers, better authentication. but they have a thing called anti-cross-site request forgery tokens. Basically, we want to make sure that if that input comes from one person, it's still coming from that same person, that same browser, the same session, and not from another process. Let's talk about buffer overflow. Buffer overflows is a type of vulnerability that occurs when a program writes more than the data buffer. What it looks like would be something like this. We've got a buffer of 10 characters. We now have a very long string that is way more than 10 characters. We still try to write that in there and we try to return it. Well, what we do is now we're going to return more than what we put in. We're going to put this in and we may get some data right next to it. In other words, we're trying to read registers around the memory that we get put in to help it maybe dump additional data that is normally wouldn't be given to us. Now there's two types of them. There's a stack-based buffer overflow, which occurs when a buffer overflow happens within the stack, hence the name stack-based, which means the stack is normally used for applications that are currently running. Think of things that are running like variables or functions, informations within that stack. And then we've got a heap-based overflow, basically outside of that stack, outside of our runtime. This is where we're going to find dynamic memory allocation. So heap-based overflows are harder to exploit because normally they don't let us to escape as easily, but attackers can still manipulate adjacent. And so we normally find ways to protect against this. Again, input validation. Make sure that we're invalidating the input of our users. Make sure that we're doing bound checking. Make sure that we're using safe programming languages that won't let us do buffer overflows. Maybe we want to use address space layout randomization. Instead of using memory in order, maybe we randomly use it throughout the RAM, so that way it's harder to see. There are things that are called stack canaries. Think of like a canary in a mine, where we'll put data in there to make sure that data is being treated properly. And if for some reason some data tries to escape, we'll be able to identify it really fast. We have data execution prevention, which which helps us, is a security feature that helps mark certain areas of memory as non-executable. This helps us prevent code from being executed in that region. And this is normally enabled on the operating or the kernel level in many cases. We got regular code testing just to make sure that the code itself is built properly and that it is not vulnerable to certain things like buffer overflow. All right, that brings us to the end here. We've got race conditions. So a race condition occurs when the behavior of a system or program depends on the timing or sequence of uncontrolled events, such as multiple processes or threads trying to access shared resources simultaneously. Oof. Okay. Well, what does that freaking mean? Okay. Example. We've got two threads A and B. They both need access to the same variable. Let's say balance, right? Let's say bike balance in a banking system. When thread A reads the balance, it says $100 and adds $50 to it. Before thread A writes the updated balance of $150, thread B reads the original balance and deducts $30. So thread B writes the updated balance as $70, but then thread A comes back and writes $150, overriding the changes of thread B. So somehow we got $30 extra in our bank account because instead of locking the transaction, we were able to read one time and write at another time. Okay, well, what is this called? It's called time to check to time of use. Okay, TOC, TOU. If you see that on an exam, just know time of check to time of use. Basically means when I checked it and before I actually used it at a later time, something in between can still happen. So if the state of the system changes between the time that I read the resources to the time that I use the resources, another process may exploit this window and interfere with its outcome. Attackers like this very much. We have a thing called like data race. And a data race occurs when two or more threads attempt to read or write the same data simultaneously without synchronization. So again, we're going to have inconsistent or even corrupt data. Data races are common sources of bugs, and mostly with multi-threaded applications, because no longer are we just doing things in serial, we've got parallel applications, and they have to be able to ensure that nothing else is touching it before they update things. which brings us to thread interleaving issues, which means multiple threads execute in overlapping sequences, and then these operations on shared resources are interleaved unpredictably. So it's hard to know what's going to happen with the synchronization because it could be, again, it can crash us, it can change the data in unexpected ways, whatever may happen. So that's our section for sorry, that's our section uh, for vulnerabilities and attacks. And hopefully you guys can take some more time, read through that. Make sure you're doing your flashcards again. Make sure you're reading other resources, not just my resources. I like Mike Chappell's book from Cybex. He does a really good job. This will help prepare you for the Security Plus. Keep studying.